Hey there, it's James Folds, and this is my presentation about the ethical case study. And what I've chosen, as I put up on the board there, is non-voluntary drug testing. Basically, the question is, when should people be forced to undergo a drug test? So when I started out researching into this topic, I'd originally wanted to do a presentation about general drug testing in Canada and look at all kinds of issues about when, as a society, we think it's okay to force somebody else to take a drug test, bearing in mind that some of these tests are can be considered pretty invasive. You have to deliver bodily fluids to another human being. Things I was going to look at is questions like, should the police be allowed to administer drug and alcohol tests, parents drug testing their children for whatever reason, courts, when can they force people to do drug tests as part of a sentence or parole? What about another hot topic issue? Should the government be allowed to test people as a condition for receiving social benefits? And should employers be allowed to test employees as a condition of employment? And what I found is there's just way too much here to cover in a 10-minute presentation. I mean, even for example, should the police be allowed to administer drug and alcohol tests? Well, I think a lot of people and the law would agree that if they suspect somebody is driving impaired, then it's ethically and legally all right to deliver a breathalyzer test. Public opinion in the law would, be against them randomly testing somebody walking down the street or something like that. So I've done is I've basically tried to narrow it down a little bit to some key areas that cover the ethical and legal issue of drug testing. So when I started out, so for time commitment, to get it under that 10 minutes, I've really had to narrow it down. I originally tried to narrow it down to two topics that covered employers testing employees for pre-employment drug checks, random tests, after incident tests, and all that, and testing by the government in order to receive social benefits. So if somebody on drugs could be denied or should be denied social benefits, basically the argument there being that should taxpayers be subsidizing somebody's drug use? And even that's not going to work, so for doing both of those, so I've selected just the one topic. Should the government, either provincial or federal, require that people pass drug tests in order to obtain social benefits? So we'll look at legally and ethically what it looks like the opinion is on that. So most of the underlying legal and ethical arguments about drug testing and receiving social benefits, or pretty much anything to do with drug testing, is the idea that addiction to drugs is a disease. This is written under the Human Rights Code and the Ontario Human Rights Code and the Canadian Human Rights Act. In Canada, as I'm sure we all know, it's illegal for an employer, the government, or anybody to discriminate against somebody based on a disability. So this would include social benefits or having a job and things like that. Now, a lot of people tend to think that this idea that addictions are the disease is a new thing, but it's really not. You can go back to the late 1700s, and even back then there were medical papers being published that argued that drunkenness is a disease that physicians should be treating. If you go back to the early 1800s in Europe, that's when first rehabilitation facilities were opening in England, and in the 1840s they began appearing in most of the United States. So the idea of treating alcohol addiction and other drugs as a disease that can be treated isn't a new one at all. I've included a Supreme Court case here, citation, and I'm not going to get too much into the details of it, but it had to do with, it was a charter challenge, and it had to do with a a person who is convicted of drunk driving requesting discharge for curative treatment because other provinces apply the law as such, but he wasn't granted that in Ontario. So he said it was discriminatory because crimes are supposed to be punished in a similar fashion right across the board. But I included that because when you read through it, there's many back and forth discussions between the judges and everything like that that talk about treatment, and it's not a new concept anyway, and that's in 1986. So when we're looking at all the laws and everything, the idea that addiction is a disease, that is what most challenges are based on. So the first case that we're going to be looking at is Entrop versus Imperial Oil Limited 2000. This is a landmark case not only in employer drug testing policies, but also in that it defines illness, or it defines alcohol or drug dependency as disease or a handicap. And in fact, the Ontario Human Rights Commission's drug and alcohol policy refers to part of the decision in this case, defining drug and alcohol dependency as a disease. So what happened here was in the early 90s, as a result, or as a response to the Exxon Valdez disaster, Imperial Oil brought in a very, very detailed drug and alcohol testing policy for its employers, especially the ones in safety sensitive positions. So Mr. Entrop worked in one of these safety sensitive positions, and as part of the policy, Imperial Oil required that its employees disclose if they have ever had in their life any type of drug or alcohol dependency issues. And Mr. Entrop had them. He'd been an alcoholic for some time, but he'd undergone treatment through Alcoholics Anonymous in the early 80s, and he had been sober for over 10 years. Nevertheless, he disclosed this as part of the policy. So what ended up happening was he was moved to a different position that was less, or wasn't safety sensitive, for the same pay, but it was a much less desirable position. And on top of that, he had to undergo some mental evaluations and random drug testing to ensure that he wouldn't relapse. And he felt that this was discriminatory. So he filed a complaint with HR, and it went all the way up to the Ontario Court of Appeals. And what came out of it was a big, massive, long decision that went through all of the drug and alcohol testing policy for Imperial Oil, and basically it said what it found was legally reasonable and what wasn't as part of the policy. So it has massive implications for employer drug testing, but also the fact that it is a legal decision that specifically defines drug and alcohol, or drug abuse and drug dependency, are diseases, illnesses, malfunction, and mental disorders which can create mental impairment and result in mental disorders and physical disability. So this hasn't been challenged in a higher court, so it hasn't been challenged. That part of the decision hasn't been challenged, or wasn't challenged, as this made its way up to the Court of Appeals. So it stands as law, basically. So the second case that we're going to look at as part of this ethical issue is a Supreme Court case that was Track-Montaigne, I believe I'm pronouncing that right, versus Ontario, more specifically the ODSP, Ontario Disability Support Program. What happened here was Mr. Track-Montaigne was an alcoholic. He applied for support under ODSP and was denied. There was no other disabilities that Mr. Track-Montaigne had other than the fact that he was an alcoholic, and he believed that, or he claimed that his alcoholism was preventing him from getting a job, and probably rightfully so. He was an alcoholic, and so much so that it would be very, very hard for him to obtain and hold down a job. So he applied for disability support from ODSP, and he was denied. At this time, the Ontario Human Rights Code clearly stated that alcoholism was considered a disease or an illness. But the problem is the Ontario Human Rights Code, the Ontario Disability Support Program, was looking at their own legislation. So the Ontario Disability Support Act, and that legislation clearly said that alcoholism would preclude somebody from obtaining ODSP. So this was appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, not necessarily to define if alcoholism is considered a disease, because the Canadian Human Rights Code and the Ontario Human Rights Code already did that, but it was more of a jurisdictional challenge. So the Ontario or ODSP was basically saying that they didn't think they had the jurisdiction to look outside of their own legislation when making these decisions. So it went up to the Supreme Court of Canada, and it came back basically saying that statutory tribunals such as the Social Benefits Tribunal and ODSP, they do have the power to look at laws outside of their own when making these decisions, and something like the Ontario Human Rights Code would trump that. So essentially what this did is solidify, as is a Supreme Court decision, that alcohol and any type of law or any government organization making a decision on whether or not alcohol is considered, or alcohol and drug use is considered an illness or disability, they do have to look outside of their own. So basically it's solidified right across the board that drug addiction is a handicap or a disability. So getting back to the ethical issue now of drug testing people in order to receive social benefits, legally it seems pretty clear that it's in reality it's not something that could happen in Canada, where we'd have a system that a person would fail a drug test and be denied social benefits. So legally it's probably not possible here in Canada. The question is too, ethically, even if it were possible legally, is it a good thing? So the way I see it, very much divided. People are very much divided on this issue, and I think a lot of it has to do with the idea of people just don't like the idea. The attitude that at the very base of it is, why should we be giving tax money for people to buy drugs with? And obviously it's a lot more complicated than that. A few surveys that I found online, basically when the question is put to people, do you think that people should pass a drug test in order to receive welfare, most respondents say, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Even recently, like governments, not just our own government, but all over the world, it's UK, there's proposals to do the same thing. Canada, even just a couple of years ago, after it had been if it had gone through the courts, there was more proposals to drug test individuals in order to, or not necessarily in order to receive benefits, but mandatory drug testing of people who are on benefits. And the way that the government worded it at that time was in order to offer them treatment, but it seems to me it was done basically as a political issue during a campaign. The argument from the side that would like to see drug testing in order to receive benefits is that it would deter people from using drugs and encourage them to go get a job. And that's what I see a lot of the time as the argument for. It's either that or simply a resentfulness. And for part of my wrap up, I'm going to kind of go through my opinion and why I think ethically it's not a good thing. So for part of the wrap up, my opinion about the law and its future, it seems pretty clear that we're moving more and more towards recognition of, if we're not already there, that drug and alcohol dependency is a disease. So to bring that into whether or not people can be tested, it seems that in Canada it's pretty much a settled deal, and it doesn't look like we're going to be moving backwards on it anytime soon. So next is basically the ethical question, and where do I stand personally on this? First, I think the thing we have to consider is I don't believe that for something to be ethically right, it needs to be something that we like the idea of. An example of this for me personally is safe injection sites. I mean, I don't like the idea that the government would be spending money to pay for people to do hard drugs. But having said that, I can clearly see how the benefits of that outweigh any of the negative effects. So we're a society that pays for ambulances to respond to people who are sick or overdosing, and we have universal health care. So all of these things, I think the idea that if we do a little bit to prevent some of the costs and some of the damage down the future, well, that's what harm reduction is, then ethically I think that's the right thing to do, even though I may not like the idea. I think a lot of that mentality can be transferred over to drug testing for social benefits too. I don't think that it's it's a pleasant idea. Nobody likes the idea that taxpayer money may be going to support somebody's drug addiction, but I also think that from a practical point of view, it's probably the lesser of two evils. Though it's probably illegal here in Canada to deny benefits based on drug testing, down in the land of the free, the United States, it has been implemented in many states, and a lot of the states are finding that it costs more money to test people for drugs than it does save in not paying out social benefits. And then the other side of that is, my thinking is, if people are so addicted to drugs or so dependent on drugs or alcohol that they aren't able to stay clean to pass a test and receive social benefits, they're going to be needing to get the money from somewhere else. So there's going to be some sort of harm done somewhere else in society that would be a result of testing people and denying them benefits based on drug or alcohol addiction. And then the final part of it is, like, my thinking is, okay, first, it's probably something that cannot legally happen in Canada. Second, if it could legally happen, it would probably end up costing more, like just from a practical point of view, costing more than it would save. So essentially we'd be wasting money. And then the third part of it, I think ethically, just the common decency of it is something that needs to be considered. I think that some people, when they do need assistance, they're having a hard enough time as it is in their life. And part of getting back on your feet, I think sometimes, is just being provided the recognition that you're a decent human being and that you're worth society investing in. I get the feeling that by stigmatizing people, it's kind of working against the idea that everybody is valued equally in our society. So that's basically where I stand, or my ethical point of view is on that. And I should also note that for my work, I'm subject to all kinds of mandatory drug testing, and there was a point where I think I was drug tested randomly 7 times within a year and a half. And my career, or my job, basically hangs in the balance of that. So yeah, so that's my point of view given my background there. So thanks a lot for taking the time to listen to my presentation here. It's changed a little bit since the topics I thought I'd first be able to cover. It's really hard to cram everything into 10 minutes. So hopefully I came close this time. And thank you very much. I look forward to seeing everybody else's presentation.